And I completely get that if you're used to complete and utter freedom, although I'm not sure there is complete and utter freedom now, but if you're used to a certain way of life, then suddenly, overnight, on December the 31st, 2046, or is it 47, that is going to be a massive shock to the whole of Hong Kong. Yeah. And I do get the emotions. Now, let's remember here, 1 million people in Hong Kong are out on the streets. If that were in Britain, that would be the equivalent to 10 to 15 million. If it was in the United States, it would be 40 to 50 million people out on the streets protesting about what's happening. That is an incredible proportion of the population. And I suspect there are many other people in Hong Kong who, having seen that a lot of their neighbours, a lot of their family have gone out, they will be encouraged to take part in these demonstrations as well. So, in a sense, it's quite difficult to see how the authorities are going to reduce the number of people protesting, because I think it could probably grow.
Facebook back up and running, or Facebook has always been back up and running. Our feed is back up and running. Falala says...
That's the most important bit of Facebook, to be honest.
Yeah. I have no faith in China. It's not a democracy. Robert says democracy isn't dying in Hong Kong, it's dying everywhere. Liam, what do you make of this? Because there's some concern about what the backlash there might be for China. The bill threatens confidence in Hong Kong's values and business. This could negatively affect China's stability and economic growth, important sources for the central government's continued hold on power.
It could indeed. I mean, we talked earlier about the trade war. One reason why Trump does have some leverage in this trade war with China is that Beijing doesn't want growth to slow. The Chinese stock market collapsed last year. That's important because so many middle-class Chinese have their savings in the stock market. They're not allowed to invest abroad. The property market's a bubble. So they will want to see continued stability and continued inward investment into China. And, you know, the way America's trade deal with Hong Kong works is that it treats Hong Kong as a distinct, discrete entity from China. So Hong Kong isn't caught up in this trade war. With one flick of his pen, with one tweet, Trump can change that. Suddenly, all the billions of dollars invested by the Chinese in Hong Kong is under threat. The trade regime in one of the world's biggest ports could completely change. That will put pressure on the Chinese, whether they want to admit it or not. So there's a battle of wills here on the streets of Hong Kong between the Hong Kong police, controlled, many believe, by the Chinese authorities, and this million-strong protest movement, which Ian says could get bigger. But then there's a geopolitical battle of wills here. China wants to impose itself in Hong Kong because it doesn't want other regions of the Chinese mainland getting ideas about autonomy and being able to overcome the state. But at the same time, it has to show some degree of discretion, or the whole thing will suffer from a business point of view, which will give Beijing itself political issues with the rest of the population.
A lot of people in Hong Kong will no doubt be asking, where's Britain? What have we heard from the British government on this at all? I haven't seen anything. Where is the Foreign Secretary? Well, he's campaigning to be leader of the Conservative Party. Where's the Prime Minister? She's a lame duck. And you would expect Britain to at least have some comment on what was going on, but so far nothing.
Protesters about the lack of international interest. Not that there's been less interest, but the foreign governments haven't been stepping in because obviously concerned about upsetting Beijing, presumably.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is, I think that's a real kind of disappointment, particularly from Britain, because Hong Kong was a really, really big part of, I suppose, you know, our kind of the last vestiges of a bit of our empire, really. And the Hong Kongese were very, very worried about what was going to happen in 1997 in terms of the handover. And Britain actually put in a lot of time and attention. We appointed a very, very senior politician, a man called Sir Chris Patten. He's now in the House of Lords. He was a very senior figure in conservative British politics. He ran the BBC. And, you know, he was appointed as to oversee this transition. And a huge amount of time and effort and care and concern went in. And one of the messages that the outgoing kind of British regime left to the people of Hong Kong, particularly there's huge numbers of expats and Brits that live there, which was, we are not going to turn our back on you. Our bonds remain very, very strong. Just because we don't have kind of oversight of you, we are still friends. Where are they now? As you're absolutely right.
But since then, the economy's doubled in size. China's a lot more assertive. I agree with Ian. It's a shame that Britain is nowhere, given the real... It's not just, you know, Britain thinking this was our empire. There's tremendous affection among the Hong Kong Chinese for their British links. Some of them have either British citizenship or an arrangement close to British citizenship. This reminds me of the time when a lot of British Ugandans were kicked out of Uganda by Idi Amin in the 70s, and the British government didn't recognise their rights. I think the British government should be stepping up to the plate here. I think we should be saying...
The British government did recognise Ugandans' rights. We took them in.
They did in the end. They did in the end, and I grew up with many of those people, that's why I mentioned it. I think the British government now should say to Hong Kong Chinese, if they do... These are incredibly talented, entrepreneurial, often wealthy people. If you want to come to the UK, you can come to the UK. I don't think many people in the UK would object to that whatsoever.
Let's just hear from Chris Patton, his view on all of this and this bill, and we'll come back to you.
It's going to damage Hong Kong if it just seems to be treated like any other Chinese mainland city. Hong Kong has been a great international hub. People are prepared to behave towards it as an economic unity, as though it's different from the rest of China. But as Congress in the United States has been suggesting, if Hong Kong just looks like the rest of China, the danger is it gets sucked into the trade wars between China and others. We don't want to see that. It would be bad and damaging for Hong Kong.
Listening to Liam.
Well, it's difficult to disagree with any of that. I think the difference between now and 1997 is that in 1997, China was not the international player that it is now, either politically or economically. We know in this country the huge amounts of Chinese investment that there have been. So I kind of understand from a realpolitik point of view why the British government is not sort of sending out salvos of criticism to Beijing. But on the other hand, you don't really want the fifth largest economy in the world being completely craven to the Chinese, and that's what is happening at the moment.
Isabel on Facebook says, if China continues its intrusion into Hong Kong's autonomy, then the UN must step in, not the UK. Heidi says, these young people are wonderful. They are very young, a lot of them, and they weren't involved with the last set of demonstrations, but might have been inspired by them. We'll be back in just a moment where we'll speak to Ivan, who's on the ground there. Yeah, it's pretty violent earlier on, where Ivan was.
Well, it sort of reminded me, and I think looking at some of the interviews with particularly some of the younger people and some of the students, and some of the footage, it sort of had echoes of Tiananmen Square, and I think that will haunt a lot of the young people. And that's why there was this housewives petition was really interesting, because I think for some of the mums, they're thinking, hang on a minute, we know how this story ends. We saw what happened in China, Tiananmen Square, huge crackdown in terms of civil liberty. So I think people in Hong Kong are genuinely really worried, because, as I say, having been there myself, and I absolutely loved it. It's an incredible place. It sort of has, you know, fabulous culture, but great efficiency as well.
I just remembered I have been there, but only for 2 hours on a flight to Australia. We stopped there. But it's one of those places that you kind of really want to go to, isn't it?
Well, we got this incredible trip because we got, you know, taken around by all the sort of dignitaries. Hospital, fantastic healthcare, fabulous kind of commercial centre, fabulous shopping, you know, really brilliant international city.
Leave the most important to
well, exactly. I was like a fiscal stimulus for the economy. That's probably why it's gone downhill, basically, when I left. But, you know, you just think... Back. Yeah, don't worry, I'll come back, people. But you just think, you know, you can see why people will be very, very worried, because it was a different story, just a short drive, you know, across the bridge.
I was in Hong Kong in 2003 covering the WTO summit, and there were riots there. And I was shocked, having covered lots of riots, just how... And that was a while ago.
Is democracy dying in Hong Kong? We're asking that question after the what the police describe as riots there today. Jimbo on Facebook says no, because it's never existed in Hong Kong. People still want what was promised. And Feli says democracy is dying in Hong Kong, but also in the US. Let's go to Ivan. He's on the ground there. You were expecting demonstrations today, but probably not the ones that, you know, you probably weren't expecting the way it turned in the end.
No, I certainly didn't expect we'd have a repeat of scenes like this, which we saw 5 years ago, where you have main thoroughfares in the city with makeshift barricades on one side and riot police on the other, periodically firing tear gas into the crowd to disperse the protesters. The riot police have been able to push some of these young demonstrators back, but there are large numbers of them out here. If we walk across this traffic overpass, which would normally be quite busy at this time of night, you can see some of the crowds in this tense face-off. We'll keep going. Look over here. Some of the crowds that have gathered to face off against the police. This is all about this very controversial draft law that the protesters fear would allow the Communist Party in mainland China to pluck any suspect from Hong Kong and take them to a very opaque political and judicial system in China where they don't feel they would get a fair shake. And this is one of the end results here. The protest that we saw on Sunday, Max, where the organizers estimate more than 1 million demonstrators came out into the streets against this law, which would be about 1 in 7 Hong Kongers, was a startling and unprecedented rebuke of the city government, and also a sign of just the incredible distrust that people in this semi-autonomous city have for the rule of law and the system of government just a short distance away in mainland China. Max.
Okay, Ivan, thank you. On Facebook, Ting says, Hong Kong, stay strong, and that's from Taiwan, and Lai is in Hong Kong. He says, please support us. This is the extradition bill we're talking about. Allows extradition to territories without formal extradition deals. Suspects could be sent to mainland China, Macau, Taiwan. This sort of bill wouldn't be controversial in many countries. We wouldn't be reporting on it in the same way, but that probably speaks to the sort of atmosphere that many Hong Kongers feel they're living in.
Look, at the heart of this, there is a bit of a truth in this. There is a legal loophole, and
Yes.
there is a terrible murder case where somebody is evading justice. So the kind of genesis
Something
of
needs
this,
to be addressed.
yeah, there is, there's a kernel of truth that does need to be addressed here. But the very legitimate fear is that this is just going to spill over into something which is much bigger, and it's a very, very big encroachment in terms of the culture, the rule of law, and will have a big chilling effect as well in terms of, business, life, academia, everything in Hong Kong. That's what the worry is. And I think the great tragedy is of this situation, and this is something that we've discussed about many other issues around the world, is just how impotent other countries really are to get involved now. I mean, realistically, what can Britain do? What can America do? What can other countries do? We're not going to send, troops in. We can toughen up our language diplomatically. As Liam said, we do a lot of business, so kind of escalating a trade war is not the right sort of thing to do. It's very, very tricky. And I think, when you untangle the sort of thicket of all these different issues going around the world, it just makes you realise that it's very hard for countries now to intervene in things like this, which is a great shame for the people of Hong Kong.
Patricia's picking up on your point. No word from my government, the UK government, which handed over a democratic Hong Kong to an autocratic China and never looked back.
Well, the point is that we didn't have any choice. We could not have turned around in 1997 and said to the Chinese, sorry, we've changed our minds. That was a legally binding treaty. So, I mean, it was, I remember that,
Did we never look
day,
back?
actually. Well,
It's a big deal.
what can you do? It was a big deal, but what can you do? We are thousands of miles away. I mean, what are people suggesting? That we should intervene militarily against the Chinese? It's madness. So there is nothing that we can do. We have to recognise that. That doesn't stop us being able to condemn what the Chinese might be doing at all. But, I mean, let's live in the real world, guys. There isn't much we can do about it.
We're so just, I think, remember, we've just had a big scandal in this country about, Chinese... Yeah, another one, about Huawei in terms of 5G and Chinese infrastructure. We have lots of issues in terms of huge amounts of Chinese investment in this country. And that's one of the really hard things. We've talked about this moral quandary. How do you balance the morality against the commercial interests? It's very difficult.
I don't think there's much Britain can do to influence what the Chinese do. I do think Britain
Should say something.
Well, I do think we conducted ourselves reasonably well in 1999. It was a difficult situation, and we did adhere to a very old treaty, as Ian says. If you don't adhere to a treaty, why should you expect the Chinese to adhere to a treaty? I do think Britain can offer sanctuary to certain Hong Kong Chinese with particularly close links to the UK. I do think that would be fair. I do think it'd actually be popular here in Britain and around the world. You're talking about incredibly able, often quite wealthy people that would massively enhance our country. The Americans are in a different situation. The Americans do have power. The Americans have power. I mean, not military power that they do, but they wouldn't use it that close to China. But they have financial power. They control the global banking system, which the Chinese need. And they're locked in this trade war now with the Chinese, which the Chinese want to solve just as much as the Americans want to solve. China exports a lot more to America than the other way around. China has a lot more skin in this game. Just like Huawei, which Aisha rightly just mentioned, this could become another little bargaining chip in that bigger geopolitical tussle between the US and China, though, of course, that will be no comfort at all for the 7.2 million Hong Kong Chinese now who are worried about losing their freedom.
The story's not actually playing that big in the United States, which is interesting.
To be fair, it hasn't in this country. Until last night, I've seen very little mention of it on the TV news in this country. I think Hong Kong for America is a place. I mean, I'm going to get into trouble for this, but would most Americans actually even have a clue where Hong Kong was?
With the President of the United States.
I left that question deliberately hanging. Mr. President, if you're watching, it's next to China.
OK. Priscilla...
China. You mean China?
These are live images. You know, this standoff continues. The numbers much less than they were earlier in the day, but I don't think the demonstrations are over if you listen to what they're saying. Priscilla on Facebook says the Hong Kong government no longer serves Hong Kong people. We pray for Hong Kong, says Joe. Thank you for watching. Do listen again. Go to Apple Podcasts, look up CNN Report.